Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today I want to talk about who we're talking to when we're talking about this idea of stewardship. You know, we get questions a lot from churches that are saying, who should we aim this conversation at? This idea of stewardship. Are we talking to people who are struggling financially? Is that who we're talking to when we're talking about stewardship and getting your act together? Are we talking to people who have a lot of means and are actually doing really well financially, and we need to talk to them about how they're stewarding all of those extra resources? Which of those are we talking to? And I would say the answer is yes. We need to talk to all of them. We need to talk to the people in your community who are struggling, who are in a really hard way, and they are having a really difficult time navigating life financially. We also need to talk to the people who aren't paying attention, who have plenty of income, but they're barely getting by. They're just kind of treading water. They're not quite making much progress, but they're also not falling into a pit of despair either. And then we also need to talk to the people who are doing really well, that have accumulated extra wealth, and they're actually really good at that. And a lot of times we think that we don't need to talk to them about stewardship because clearly they're really good at stewarding money because they have a lot of it. That's not necessarily true. Those things don't always go together. And so it is a really complicated conversation to be able to talk to all three of those categories at once. And just to give you an idea, that's why we set up the Freed Up app at Good Sense. We built that app in order to be able to talk to all three of those audiences simultaneously, in order to have those conversations, because they're different. They're different issues, different struggles, different reasons for those struggles, and we need to have conversations that are specific to those circumstances while also giving everyone the same language, the same concepts to work from, the same frameworks to build their financial life out of. Those are all universal, and yet the application of each of those things is individual. And that's why I think this conversation is so hard. I think historically the church has spoken in one camp. If they talk about money, they're talking about people struggling with money. They're sending them over into one corner and they're saying, you go deal with that. You go through a financial crisis ministry. And then to other people who have lots of money, they're talking to them about raising money, about getting some of their generosity. And those are, by definition, totally different conversations happening at totally different times and for totally different reasons. That's the work we need to do. We got to bring this conversation back to be a universal, consistent discussion with similar language where everyone is talking in the same way about the same things, regardless of their circumstances. But each of those circumstances requires a different focus. And that's really what I want to talk about today. When we are diving into these discussions with these different audiences, what are we actually trying to accomplish when we're thinking about financial stewardship? In the first category, the people who are in trouble, and they know it. We don't need to shame them, scold them, tell them they're dumb. They feel shame already. They feel inadequate. They feel like failures. We need to meet them in that pain and treat them with kindness and dignity and warmth and tell them there is a path forward. In stewardship, there is a path to understanding why they're struggling and getting to a place of stability. And that really is the key word for that category. The most important thing for people who are struggling financially to accomplish is this foundational stability where they know how to do it. They get confidence. They start to have understanding of why they're in the situation that they're in. I find so often that people who are struggling financially assume that the only reason that they have that problem is because they're not tracking their spending well. They just need to cut their expenses. They need to find the magic bullet that will finally free them from all this stuff, and it's all in their spending. If they just spend nothing on anything ever, then they'll be okay. But a lot of times their struggle is rooted in their earning, that there really isn't enough to cut from the spending side to make the math work. And so in the financial crisis stage, our priority is to get them to a place of stability, a place where cash flow is normalized and steadied, where we understand how much income we need to create in order to account for and accomplish what their life costs. And a lot of times that's where the mismatch is. They feel like they're beating their head against a wall because it just won't work. And they don't understand why it won't work. And they feel really unsafe, insecure, and unsteady. And we need to steady them. We need to meet them in that space and treat them with dignity because they deserve it. And we need to call them up out of that situation with steps, very practical steps that they can take to normalize and stabilize their cash flow and put themselves in a position where they can gain more confidence that they're going to be okay. That is so important in that category. Get them out of that crisis mindset, because when we're in a crisis mindset, we don't think clearly. We don't make good decisions because we're in panic mode. We're in survival mode. We can't even think about our future, quite frankly. We're thinking only about making sure we get what we need today. And it really messes up our decision making. And so we got to get them to a place where they can stand on something solid, and then they can start to make more clear-headed decisions going forward. And they can start to get out of the hole that they may have found themselves in. That's the work in that first category of people who are struggling. It needs to be done in a way that is kind and warm and inspirational. They can do it. They just need the tools. The second category, those are the people who are in trouble and they don't know it. They're not paying attention. They're spending beyond their means. Maybe they're racking up a little bit of credit card debt, or maybe more than a little bit of credit card debt, and they're finding themselves perpetually spinning. They have plenty of income. They have enough cash flow to make their life work, but their spending habits are creating this pattern where they keep running their spending right up to their income levels. One of the problems with that category of conversation is a lot of times they don't feel like they're in trouble because they're paying their bills. They don't see this as a problem. And so where the first category is very aware of the problem, we don't need to convince them that they're in trouble. They're very aware of it. The second category is in trouble, but it doesn't feel like it. They can kind of be the frog in the boiling pot, where over time they are finding their net worth declining or staying stagnant, and they're missing out on the benefit of time. They're not saving adequately. They're not paying their debt down adequately. And so their net worth is not growing, but their bills are paid. And so as far as they know, they're doing just fine. But we got to catch them in that season and wake them up. This is not a smack them around and beat them up kind of conversation, but it is a little bit of an alert. Hey, I know that your bills are being paid. I know that you think you're okay, but there is a way bigger hill to climb than you're aware of, and you're not climbing it. You're not paying attention. You're not being intentional. You're allowing your income to determine how much you spend, rather than spending what is decided ahead of time because you've built that lifestyle cap. You've said this is enough. You need to reverse that trend. You got to stop just spending whatever income comes in, and you've got to get to a place where you're deciding intentionally what you're going to spend and why, because that's what faithful stewardship looks like. Faithful stewards would be able to tell the owner of the resources how they spent his resources and why. And a lot of times that's the disconnect. They just spend because they have it. And that makes sense. It's human nature. We're constantly being incentivized to spend in our consumer society, but we need to shift that behavior. We need to change that paradigm and get to a place where the expectation is intentionality. And then all of these other things start to open up. The hill starts to get easier to climb. They become more aware of the work they need to do and the savings they need to generate, and they start to put some of those boundaries in place in their life. But that is a different conversation than the stability focus in that first category. These families need clarity. They need to understand where the money is going. They need to be able to see what's actually happening. So often these families have so many bills flying at them and they just write the checks and pay the bills, and they're not even really aware of just how those bills stack on top of each other and create this tension that they're living under. They're just used to it now. They're the frog in the boiling pot. And we need to wake them up to the situation they're in and call them to more faithfulness in their stewardship of the resources God has given them to manage. That third category, those are the people who, quite frankly, don't engage in this conversation very often. The people who have means. They have large net worths. They are saving really well. They make money easily. They provide a tremendous amount of value and they're compensated well, and they save those resources. They don't spend beyond their means. We tend to see them check out of the stewardship conversation. And I would argue that's mostly because we tend to be talking to category 1 or 2 when we have the stewardship conversation. And they say, I don't have credit card debt. I'm not in financial crisis. I don't need this conversation. And yet in the meantime, they are finding their security in their resources. They're finding their significance, their sense of power, their sense of influence based on their wealth. And they are at high risk of ending up serving money. They tend to drift in that direction if we don't catch them and have an intentional conversation around legacy. And that's the key word for this category of families. They need to recognize that these resources that they've saved are all still God's. And now the question is, what does it look like to be obedient with those resources? If you saved them for your own security, you're going to get more and more confident in your own self-sufficiency. But if you saved them for future obedience, then now the question is, what does obedience look like with those resources? What is God asking you to do with his money? How do you honor him with what you've accumulated? If we can talk about legacy and impact with them rather than building campaigns and funding for the church that we're serving. I know that's where we go a lot of times with these families, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have those conversations at all. I'm just saying that when that's the only conversation we're having with them, we leave them subject to serving money. We leave them open to the risk of falling prey to that path simply because it is a natural path for them to run down. I mean, Jesus made very clear that it is very hard for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, right? This is a hard thing because wealthy individuals can very easily fall into this sense of security and self-sufficiency and lose sight of legacy and impact. And our job as leaders in those communities is to call them back to the awareness that God owns all of it and that what they saved it for was actually to be in position to be obedient with it now. What they saved it for is to build to a place where they have the confidence to say yes when God asks them to engage in the work his kingdom is up to. That is where we need to meet them. And again, those are very different conversations. They're incredibly different applications, but they're all rooted in the same key concepts that God owns it all and always will. Not just their financial resources, but all of their resources. God owns everything. The second key piece is that we are supposed to be intentional about honoring God with what he has given us. All three of those categories need an intentionality. The first one needs an intentionality of getting to a place of stability. The second category, they need an intentionality of just being aware and deciding ahead of time how they're going to spend their resources. And the third category needs intentionality of how they're going to use those extra resources that they've overaccumulated. It's all intentionality with God's resources. We need to be paying attention and tracking and organizing and aiming these resources at faithful stewardship, no matter which of those categories we fall in. Those are things that apply to everyone. I've had conversations with people who are in that third category and they don't track anything because they have plenty. And they say, we don't really need to track any of it because, we always have more than we need. And my argument back to them is that being a faithful steward means that even if you have plenty, you can still account for and report back to the owner of the resources what you did with his stuff. You need to be able to tell him, this is what I did and why. Even if you don't need it for your own sense of security or your own sense of stability, you need it for your own sense of responsibility to the owner of those resources. And so all of these things apply no matter which of those categories these families are in. And yet, the application of them, the individual situations are so widely varied that it is really difficult to engage the whole church in this conversation with practical application when those applications are so different. That's why the Freed Up app exists. And I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. Go to getfreedup.com. You can learn all about that app and how the church can use it to bridge that gap. You can talk to your church about the high-level truths around stewardship and let the app give the direct individual application that each of those families need, no matter what category they're in. That's the beauty. The app can actually do the practical blocking and tackling work for each family while you can lead your church in a higher level conversation around stewardship. Now is a great time in January to start mapping out when in your church calendar you're going to have this conversation around stewardship. And the answer, who should we be talking to when we talk about stewardship, is everyone. Everyone in your community needs this conversation. We need to have this be a constant discussion in our communities with shared language and shared reference points and shared frameworks so that all of our families thrive financially while they grow spiritually. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.